For years, life in my neighborhood had been quiet, steady, and predictable. I had chosen Theoria carefully, not just for the wide streets and tidy lawns, but for the promise of community. When my husband and I first moved into our home, the Homeowners Association seemed harmless enough. The brochures we were handed at closing boasted of well-maintained parks, seasonal decorations, and a neighborhood watch that gave everyone a sense of security. Back then, the HOA sounded less like an obligation and more like an extended family, of people working together to preserve the value of their homes. At first, I believed in the vision. I attended the monthly meetings, brought cookies for the bake sales, and even helped organize a summer block party. I wasn't naive. I knew HOAs, had a reputation for being strict, but I thought ours was different. Ours, I believed, had heart. But that belief began to crack the longer I lived under their rules. It started small, the way most things do. A notice slipped into my mailbox reminding me that my garden hose shouldn't be left visible on the lawn. A warning taped to my door about my holiday lights staying up too long past New Year's. I brushed it off at first, telling myself rules were rules and it wasn't worth getting worked up over little things. After all, the HOA was supposed to keep things looking nice, but then the notices became more frequent, more nitpicky, and more unreasonable. Suddenly, I couldn't step outside without feeling like I was being watched. The person most responsible for that feeling had a name, Dolores, but no one called her that. Around the neighborhood, she was simply known as Karen. She was the HOA president, self-appointed watchdog, and self-declared queen of the subdivision. With her clipboard, ever-present sunglasses, and a permanent frown, she patrolled the streets daily, documenting every perceived infraction. Trash cans left out for more than 12 hours? Ticket. A single weed daring to poke through the mulch? Warning. A car parked with its back bumper slightly crossing the sidewalk? Threat of towing. For years, I tried to stay on her good side. I kept my grass neatly trimmed, my hedges shaped, and my front porch spotless. But no amount of compliance ever seemed to satisfy her. If she couldn't find a problem, she would invent one. It became clear that Karen didn't just enforce the rules, she thrived on them. The HOA gave her power, and she wielded it like a weapon. The breaking point for me came one summer afternoon. My grandson had visited for the weekend, and we had spent hours in the backyard setting up a small inflatable pool. It wasn't fancy, just something fun for him to splash in under the hot sun. He laughed and played until his cheeks were red, and the sight of his joy made the hassle of filling it worthwhile. But the next morning, I woke to find a bright orange violation notice stuck to my door. The pool, apparently, was not approved. According to the HOA bylaws, temporary water features were prohibited unless granted written permission. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a community anymore. It was a prison, with Karen acting as warden. I could feel the resentment building inside me, a tight coil that wound tighter each time I saw her smug expression as she strolled past my house. I started to ask myself, why was I paying hundreds of dollars in dues every year just to live under constant surveillance? Why was I funding the very organization that made my life miserable? So I did something most homeowners never consider. I looked for a way out. It wasn't easy. HOAs are designed to keep homeowners locked in, both financially and legally. But after weeks of research, I discovered that our subdivision had an unusual clause buried deep within the governing documents. It allowed homeowners who owned their land outright to formally withdraw their property from the association with proper legal filings. It required paperwork, notarization, and a formal declaration submitted to the county clerk's office. It was tedious, yes, but not impossible. The day I finalized the withdrawal, I felt free for the first time in years. My home was no longer under HOA jurisdiction. Their rules no longer applied to me. My lawn, my garden, my decorations. Suddenly they were mine again. I celebrated quietly, sipping iced tea on my porch, knowing Karen couldn't touch me anymore. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize then was that freedom comes with a price, especially when you're dealing with someone like Karen. To her, my withdrawal wasn't just a personal decision. It was an act of rebellion, and rebellion was something she couldn't tolerate. At first, it was little things. I'd catch her lingering on the sidewalk in front of my house longer than usual, jotting down notes on her clipboard even though she had no authority over me anymore. I'd find her parked across the street, watching, waiting like a hawk circling prey it could no longer reach. Neighbors began whispering that she was furious, that she considered my withdrawal an insult to her leadership. She told anyone who would listen that if I got away with leaving, others would follow, and her control would crumble. One evening, I came home to find a pamphlet stuffed in my mailbox, a thinly veiled warning from the HOA. It claimed that homeowners who tried to withdraw would face serious consequences, though it never specified what those were. It was pure intimidation, and I knew exactly whose hands had delivered it. Still, I stood my ground. I had followed the law, filed the paperwork, and freed myself. There was nothing she could legally do to pull me back under her rule. But Karen wasn't interested in legalities. She was interested in power. And when someone like her feels that power slipping away, they lash out. I didn't know it yet, but Karen was already planning her next move. She wasn't just going to make my life uncomfortable. She was going to try to ruin it. And the first step in her plan? A phone call to the police. Karen did not take my withdrawal from the HOA quietly. If anything, it seemed to light a fire under her. Where before she had limited herself to petty notices and glares, now her tactics escalated into something far more hostile. It began with gossip. Karen had always been the self-appointed voice of the neighborhood, but now her conversations turned sharply in my direction. I would be trimming my roses in the front yard and hear her voice carrying from across the street, dripping with disdain. As she told anyone within earshot that I was destroying the community, she painted me as reckless, claiming that without HOA oversight, my home would soon become an eyesore, my lawn overgrown, my property values plummeting. None of it was true, of course. My yard remained neat, my paint fresh, my flower beds thriving. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was perception, and Karen was determined to turn the neighbors against me. The whispers spread quickly. Some neighbors kept their distance, avoiding eye contact when I waved. Others went further, parroting Karen's claims and questioning why I thought I was too good for the HOA. I noticed a subtle but steady shift in the atmosphere. Where there had once been warmth, there was now suspicion. Where there had been friendliness, there was coldness. I could feel Karen's influence closing in around me like a net. Still, I refused to bend. I reminded myself that I had done everything, legally, that my decision to leave was valid and final. But Karen wasn't satisfied with social shunning. She wanted me punished, and she was about to take things to another level. One evening, I returned home from the grocery store to find a bright, orange sticker slapped across my garage door. It looked official at first glance, stamped with the HOA's logo and the word violation in bold letters. My heart raced until I remembered I wasn't under HOA jurisdiction anymore. Their stickers meant nothing to me, yet the sight still rattled me. It was harassment, plain and simple. When I peeled it off, I saw sticky residue smeared across the paint, as though it had been placed there deliberately to damage the surface. The next morning, I found another sticker. This time on my mailbox, then one on my fence, each one accusing me of nonsense violations, improper lawn maintenance, unauthorized decorations, failure to store trash cans. It was like a twisted scavenger hunt, each sticker mocking my freedom. I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen. I considered calling the police then, but I hesitated. What would I say? That the HOA president was sticking fake violation notices on my property? It sounded petty, even though the intent was anything but. I didn't want to waste an officer's time over something so small. Besides, I told myself, maybe if I ignored her, she would eventually get bored and stop. But Karen didn't stop. A week later, I woke to the sound of hammering. When I stepped outside, I froze in disbelief. A brand new HOA sign had been staked into my front yard overnight. It was a garish thing, bright red letters declaring my home out of compliance. Beneath it, in smaller text, it warned that my property posed a risk to neighborhood value. Neighbors slowed their cars to read it, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment. I yanked the sign out of the ground and threw it into the trash, my hands shaking with fury. That was no longer petty harassment. That was public humiliation. Karen wasn't content to annoy me privately. She wanted to brand me as an outcast. That evening, I finally confronted her. As she strolled down the street, clipboard in hand, I stepped onto my porch and called out firmly, telling her she had no authority over me anymore and to stop trespassing on my property. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smirked, her sunglasses glinting in the fading light. She told me, loud enough for the nearby neighbors to hear, that I'd made a huge mistake leaving the HOA and that I would regret it. Then she turned on her heel and walked away. Her words lingered with me all night. "You'll regret it." They weren't just a threat. They were a promise. The next phase of her campaign came swiftly. I started receiving anonymous complaints filed with the county. First, a claim that my backyard fence was too tall. Then a report alleging that my shed violated building codes. Each one forced me to waste time proving compliance. Each one carried the sting of knowing Karen was orchestrating it all behind the scenes. By now, I was emotionally exhausted. Every day felt like a battle, and every night I wondered what fresh scheme she would concoct. My friends urged me to stay strong, but the constant stress weighed heavily on me. I had withdrawn from the HOA to reclaim peace, yet somehow I was living under even greater turmoil than before. The final straw came on a Saturday morning. I had just finished watering my plants when I heard raised voices outside. Two men in reflective vests were standing by my driveway taking photos of my house. When I asked what they were doing, they explained that they had received a report claiming my property was in violation of municipal codes regarding hazardous waste disposal. Hazardous waste? I was stunned. Nothing could have been further from the truth. I knew then that Karen had crossed into dangerous territory. Filing false reports wasn't just harassment. It was illegal. I felt my patience snap. No more ignoring her. No more hoping she would stop. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my son. He had been watching my struggle quietly, offering support but respecting my wish to handle things on my own. But when I told him about the inspectors, I saw his expression change. Calm, controlled, but firm. He reminded me that harassment like this didn't have to be endured. He asked me for details, dates, and documentation. At first, I didn't understand why he was suddenly so serious. But then I remembered my son wasn't just my son. He was also a police officer. And as I laid out everything Karen had done, he listened carefully, his jaw tightening with each detail. Finally, he told me something I would never forget. "Mom, if she keeps pushing, it won't be you who regrets leaving the HOA. It'll be her." At the time, I thought he was just reassuring me. What I didn't know was that Karen was already planning her boldest move yet. She was going to weaponize the very system she thought she controlled. She was going to call the cops on me. By the time summer hit its peak, the tension between me and Karen was no longer just background noise. It was the rhythm of my days. Every time I opened my curtains, I scanned the street, half expecting to see her car idling nearby. Every time I checked my mailbox, I braced myself for another fake violation notice or some thinly veiled threat. It wasn't paranoia, it was routine. Karen had made herself a constant presence in my life, but harassment for people like her has a cycle. What starts as whispers escalates to intimidation, and eventually, it boils over into something reckless. I didn't realize how close we were to that boiling point until the day she dragged the police into it. The morning began quietly enough. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the rare silence, when I noticed Karen across the street, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking animatedly, gesturing with her free hand as though she were in the middle of some dramatic argument. At first I ignored it. Karen lived for drama after all. But then she stopped pacing, her eyes locking on me with a sharp, victorious glare. She smirked, just the faintest twitch of her lips, and turned away. That was the moment I knew she was calling the cops. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, a patrol car rolled slowly into the neighborhood, lights flashing. My stomach dropped as it pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions professional but wary, as if they'd been briefed about some dangerous situation. Karen materialized almost instantly, hurrying from her yard to intercept them. She waved her arms like a conductor summoning an orchestra, her voice shrill as she declared that I was in violation of multiple neighborhood ordinances and that my home was a hazard to the entire community. I stood there, stunned. Neighborhood ordinances? Hazards? She spoke as though I were running a meth lab in my basement, not tending to my flower beds. The officers listened politely, jotting down notes, though I could see one of them suppressing a flicker of skepticism. Finally, they turned to me. "Ma'am, we received a call regarding code violations and possible unsafe conditions on your property," one of them said. "Do you mind if we take a quick look?" I could feel the heat rising in my face. Anger, humiliation, disbelief, all of it swirled together. But I forced myself to stay calm. "Officers," I said evenly, "I withdrew from the HOA months ago. Their rules don't apply to me. And as for safety issues, you're welcome to look. My property is perfectly fine." They walked the perimeter politely, glancing at my fence, my shed, my garden. One even chuckled softly at the sight of my freshly planted roses. Within minutes, it was clear there was nothing remotely hazardous about my home. The officers returned, their tone gentler now. "Ma'am, everything looks in order here," one said. "We'll file this as unfounded." Karen's face turned crimson. She protested loudly, insisting they were missing something, that he was manipulating the situation, that my shed contained illegal equipment. Her accusations grew wilder with every breath. Finally, one officer turned to her and asked pointedly, "Do you have any actual evidence of illegal activity here, ma'am?" She faltered. For the first time, her confidence cracked. Well, not exactly, but that's what we thought," the officer interrupted. His patience was clearly thinning. "Please refrain from wasting emergency resources in the future. That should have ended it. That should have been the moment Karen realized she had gone too far. But people like her don't stop when confronted. They double down." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I heard shouting outside. I stepped onto my porch and saw Karen arguing with 2 neighbors. They stood with their arms crossed, shaking their heads as she pointed furiously in my direction. Her voice carried across the street. "If we don't stop her, this neighborhood will fall apart. She thinks she's above the rules, and the rest of you are too weak to do anything about it." The neighbors eventually walked away, leaving her standing there fuming. But her words echoed in my mind. She wasn't just angry at me. She was rallying others, trying to recruit them into her crusade. That made her dangerous. I called my son that night, my voice trembling as I told him everything. He listened silently until I finished, then asked me a simple question. "Do you want me to step in now?" I hesitated. Part of me still wanted to handle it alone, to prove that I wasn't going to be bullied. But the truth was, Karen had crossed a line. She had involved the police, wasted their time, and tried to smear me as a criminal in front of the whole neighborhood. I told him yes. Yes, it was time. He didn't tell me what he planned to do, but there was a firmness in his voice when he said, "All right, Mom. Next time she calls, I'll handle it." The following week, Karen's harassment reached a fever pitch. She filed more county complaints. She spread rumors that I was hoarding junk cars in my backyard. She even went so far as to throw a special meeting of the HOA, complete with printed flyers warning that non-compliant residents were endangering property values. Though I wasn't invited, I heard plenty from neighbors afterward. Most rolled their eyes at her theatrics, but a few seemed genuinely swayed. The lines in the community were being drawn, and Karen was desperate to keep herself in control. Finally, the call came. It was a Sunday afternoon when another patrol car appeared in front of my house, but this time, when the officer stepped out, I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't just any officer, it was my son. Karen stormed out of her house, triumphant. She launched into another tirade, waving her arms and spewing accusations about my home being illegal and unsafe. She didn't even glance at the officer, too caught up in her own fury. But when she finally turned toward him, her words stumbled. Her eyes widened as she saw the badge clipped to his chest, the familiar shape of his face, and the unmistakable resemblance to me. For the first time, Karen looked uncertain, and that uncertainty was about to change everything. Karen had always believed the HOA gave her authority, but when the patrol car rolled up that Sunday, she thought she had reached the peak of her power. She strutted toward the officers, with her chin high, her voice dripping with the confidence of someone who had never once considered the possibility of being wrong. "This is the house," she cried, pointing dramatically at my front porch where I stood frozen. "This woman is in violation of multiple ordinances. She's dangerous. You need to remove her before she drags this whole neighborhood down. My son, Officer Daniels, to—" Everyone else didn't respond right away. He just stood there calmly, his hand resting lightly on his belt, letting her rant. His expression was unreadable, but Ick knew that look. I'd seen it countless times when he was a teenager, and his younger sister tried to pin her mischief on him. It was the look of someone waiting patiently for a liar to hang themselves with their own words. Karen continued, her volume rising with every sentence. She accused me of running illegal businesses out of my garage, of hiding toxic waste in my shed, of throwing wild parties that disturbed the peace. Each claim grew more ridiculous than the last. The neighbors had begun to gather. By now, some watching from their lawns, others peering through curtains. It was a spectacle, and Karen was the star of her own delusional show. Finally, my son raised a hand, his voice steady but firm. "Ma'am, that's enough. I need you to calm down and explain exactly what law you believe has been broken." Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off by the directness of his tone. Then she straightened her shoulders and jabbed her finger toward me. "She broke HOA laws. She withdrew illegally, and she refuses to comply with community standards. That's criminal." At that, my son's lips twitched into the faintest smirk. He turned his head slowly toward me, then back to her. "HOA laws aren't criminal statutes. Ma'am, they're civil agreements. And from what I can tell, this homeowner filed all the proper paperwork to remove herself from the HOA. Which means," he paused deliberately, "she's not under your authority anymore." The color drained from Karen's face, but only for a second. She recovered quickly, shaking her head furiously. No, you don't understand. She's lying. She thinks she's above the rules, but this neighborhood needs structure. If you—" "Don't arrest her, then." My son cut her off sharply, his voice louder now. "Arrest her? For what exactly? Having flowers in her yard? Owning a legal shed? Ma'am, do you realize you just called in an emergency response unit for a non-existent crime?" Karen sputtered, her composure unraveling. I was just doing my duty." As HOA president, it's my responsibility to keep order. If you won't handle it, I'll call your supervisor and demand someone who will. That was the moment my son dropped the act. He unclipped his badge, holding it up for her to see clearly. You already did call, ma'am, and I am the supervisor. On duty today. The effect was immediate. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Karen's eyes went wide as saucers, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For once, she had no words. He stepped closer, his tone low and unyielding. Here's what I see: repeated false reports, harassment of a private citizen, and misuse of police resources. Do you understand those are criminal offenses? Karen's bravado crumbled. She stammered, waving her arms wildly as if trying to swat away his words. No, you don't mean that. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. It's not a crime to care. It's a crime to lie, my son said flatly. It's a crime to weaponize emergency services against your neighbors. And it's a crime to trespass, vandalize, and harass, which we have plenty of evidence of, thanks to the statements your neighbors have already given. At that, several people in the crowd nodded, murmuring agreement. One man even stepped forward and said, "She put fake violation stickers on my garage, too. I didn't report it, but I should have." Another added, "She's been threatening everyone for months. We were too afraid to speak up." The tide had turned. Karen's support base was gone, replaced by a wall of witnesses ready to back me up. And standing at the center of it all was my son, calm and unshakable, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Karen's voice broke into a desperate whine. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. I'll sue you. I'll sue the department. My son held up a hand. "Ma'am, turn around. You're under arrest for filing false police reports, harassment, and misuse of emergency services." The gasp from the crowd was audible. I stood there stunned as Karen's face went through a rapid-fire series of emotions: shock, outrage, disbelief, and finally, fear. She backed up a step, shaking her head violently. "No, you can't do this to me. I run this neighborhood." "You don't run anything," my son said evenly. "Not anymore." When he placed the handcuffs on her wrists, the scene felt almost surreal. The woman who had terrorized me and so many others was being led away in front of the very people she once lorded over. Her protests grew weaker as the reality sank in. "This isn't fair. I was just doing my job." The officers who had arrived with my son placed her in the back of the patrol car. She sat there, rigid and pale, staring blankly out the window as though her world had just collapsed. And in many ways, it had. The crowd began to disperse slowly, neighbors shaking their heads, some whispering to each other about how long they had put up with her antics. A few even came over to me, apologizing for not speaking out sooner, thanking me for standing up to her. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but as I stood there on my porch, watching the patrol car drive away with Karen inside, I realized something important. This wasn't the end. Karen was out of power, yes, but the host still loomed large. And without her, the organization itself might crumble, or it might fight harder than ever to hold on to control. Either way, the days of silent suffering in this neighborhood were over. The tide had turned, and the reckoning had only just begun. The day Karen was arrested will always be etched in my memory, not just for the shock of seeing her led away in handcuffs, but for the ripple effect it sent through the neighborhood. 4 years, Karen had been the face and voice of the HOA. Loud, overbearing, and impossible to ignore. Her absence was like a sudden silence after a storm, unsettling at first, but filled with a strange kind of relief. The very next morning, I woke to a different sound. Laughter. Genuine, light-hearted laughter from children riding their bikes down the street. For so long, their parents had kept them indoors or under constant supervision, afraid that Karen would scold them for leaving chalk drawings on the sidewalk or riding too close to someone's lawn. With her gone, the air itself seemed lighter. But not everyone was celebrating. The HOA board scrambled to contain the damage. Without Karen barking orders, the remaining members tried to project authority, sending out letters filled with stiff language about maintaining standards and respecting the integrity of the community. It was almost comical, watching them pretend nothing had changed, as if Karen's arrest hadn't just shattered their credibility. Neighbors weren't buying it anymore. In fact, Karen's downfall seemed to give people permission to speak out. Within days, stories poured forth like floodwaters. One neighbor admitted she had been fined $200 for planting the wrong type of tree in her backyard. Another revealed that Karen had threatened to sue him over a trampoline his grandchildren used. A young couple confessed that Karen had made their lives so miserable they were considering selling their home. Now that she was gone, they all realized they weren't alone. The fear she had cultivated, the silence she had enforced, it evaporated, almost overnight. And with that came a new wave of action. A group of homeowners, emboldened by Karen's arrest, called for an emergency vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. They argued that the association no longer served the community, that it had been twisted into a weapon of control rather than a tool for preservation. Others suggested replacing it with a voluntary neighborhood association, one focused on community events and improvements rather than punishments and fines. The board resisted, of course. They insisted Karen was just one bad apple, that the system itself was sound. But their pleas fell flat. Too many people had suffered for too long. For me personally, the days after her arrest were surreal. Neighbors who once avoided me now approached, me with smiles, some even apologizing for believing Karen's lies. One man, Mr. Jenkins, from down the street, shook my hand firmly and said, "You stood up to her when the rest of us were too scared. You should be proud." I wanted to feel proud, and in some ways I did, but there was also a heaviness that lingered. Standing up to Karen had taken a toll on me, months of stress, fear, and isolation. Even with her gone, I still jumped whenever I heard a knock on my door, half expecting another false accusation or complaint. My son noticed it too. He visited often in those first weeks, checking in on me, reminding me that Karen's case was being taken seriously. "Mom," he told me one evening, "she's not coming back anytime soon. The charges are solid. Filing false police reports isn't something the courts brush off." I nodded, but part of me couldn't shake the image of her face when she was cuffed. The fury, the disbelief. People like Karen didn't just disappear quietly. They schemed, they plotted, they came back swinging. And sure enough, she tried. 2 weeks after her arrest, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was handwritten, scrawled in Karen's unmistakable script. The message was messy, almost frantic. "You think you've won, but this isn't over. I'll get out, and when I do, you'll see who really runs this place." My stomach churned as I read it. She wasn't repentant. She wasn't humbled. She was vowing revenge. I handed the letter straight to my son. He read it, his jaw tightening. "This is intimidation," he said flatly. "It'll only hurt her case. Don't worry, Mom. We'll add it to the file." Part of me was relieved, but another part braced for impact. Karen was down, but she wasn't done. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued its transformation. The HOA board called for another meeting, but attendance was pitiful. Half the community had stopped paying dues altogether, daring the board to enforce fines they no longer feared. The once powerful organization was collapsing under its own weight. One evening, I found myself sitting outside with a few neighbors, sharing iced tea and stories. For the first time since moving here, I felt like I belonged. Without Karen policing every blade of grass, people were relaxed, friendly, human. It was bittersweet. This was the community I had always hoped for, but it had taken so much conflict to reach it. Still, the shadow of Karen loomed. The board announced she had been formally removed as president, but rumors spread quickly. She was trying to make bail. She was hiring lawyers. She was threatening lawsuits from behind bars. No one knew exactly what would happen, but one thing was certain: her influence was broken. My son told me the case was progressing faster than expected. "Honestly, Mom," he said with a rare smile, "the DA is treating this as an example. They want to send a message that you can't weaponize the police just because you don't like your neighbor." That gave me hope, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't finished. People like her didn't surrender. They regrouped. They schemed. They waited for a chance to claw back control. But this time, she wasn't facing a scared homeowner she could bully. She was facing the law, and she had already underestimated just how serious the consequences of her actions would be. As the days stretched into weeks, the community began to settle into its new normal. The HOA weakened, neighbors grew closer, and I felt stronger than I had in years. Still, a question lingered in the back of my mind. When Karen finally got out, what would she do? The answer, I would soon learn, was far more dramatic than anyone expected. For weeks after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Some said she'd never be seen again, that the charges would stick and she'd end up serving serious time. Others whispered that she'd find a way out, that people like her always did. Me? I tried not to think about it too much. I focused on my garden, my porch, and my peace, the very things she'd tried to strip away from me. But peace has a way of being fragile, especially when you know someone like Karen is lurking in the background. Sure enough, a month later, the inevitable happened. Karen was released on bail while awaiting trial. The news spread like wildfire through the community, igniting fresh waves of gossip and anxiety. Some neighbors feared she'd come storming back, clipboard in hand, demanding obedience as if nothing had happened. Others scoffed, saying she'd lost all credibility and wouldn't dare show her face. I wasn't sure which version of Karen would return: the humiliated woman in handcuffs or relentless tyrant who refused to back down. The answer came one Friday afternoon. I was weeding my flower beds when I spotted her car creeping down the street. She drove slowly, windows rolled down, her sunglasses perched firmly on her nose. She looked the same as always, but there was something different in her demeanor. Her movements were sharper, her expression harder. This wasn't a woman who had learned a lesson. This was a woman planning a comeback. She didn't stop at my house that day, but I could feel her eyes burning into me as she passed. Later, neighbors reported she had visited a few homes, trying to rally support. She told them she'd been wrongfully arrested, that the charges were politically motivated, and that she intended to restore order once her name was cleared. But something had shifted in the neighborhood. People didn't cower anymore. They listened politely, then shut their doors. Some even told her outright that they were done with her games. The very power she had once wielded so effortlessly had evaporated. Still, Karen wasn't finished. The HOA board, desperate to prove they still mattered, announced an emergency town hall to discuss the future of the community. Karen showed up, of course, marching in with a stack of papers and that old air of authority. But this time, she wasn't met with silence and compliance. She was met with opposition. I went to that meeting, sitting quietly in the back as the drama unfolded. Karen launched into her usual tirade about standards, property values, and the dangers of letting people do whatever they want. But instead of nodding along, neighbors stood up and challenged her. "Where were you when you fined me $300 for planting the wrong flowers?" One woman demanded. "You embarrassed my kids for leaving bikes on the sidewalk," another man said. "You called them delinquents." The room buzzed with frustration, years of pent-up resentment spilling out at once. For the first time, Karen didn't have control of the narrative. Her voice faltered as more and more people spoke against her. Finally, the new acting board president, a quiet man named Harris, stood up and said plainly, "We've had enough. This HOA is dissolved effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. Karen tried to protest, waving her stack of papers in the air, but no one was listening anymore. Her reign was over. After the meeting, I walked home slowly, a strange mix of relief and disbelief washing over me. It was done. The HOA, the source of so much conflict, was gone. The neighborhood was free, but Karen wasn't quite finished with me. 2 days later, I found her waiting on the sidewalk in front of my house. She didn't have her clipboard. She didn't have her usual smug expression. Instead, she looked desperate. "You ruined me," she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "I built this neighborhood. I kept it together, and you destroyed everything." I held my ground, my voice calm. "No, Karen. You destroyed it yourself. People were tired of being bullied. You gave them no choice." Her eyes narrowed, her fists clenching at her sides. For a moment I thought she might actually lunge at me, but then my son's car pulled into the driveway, and she froze. The sight of his badge still had power over her. Without another word, she turned and stormed off, her footsteps echoing down the street. That was the last time I ever saw her. Her trial came and went. She was convicted of filing false police reports, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. The sentence wasn't long, probation, community service, and fines, but it was enough to strip her of the authority she had once wielded. Word spread that she sold her house and moved away, muttering about ungrateful neighbors, until the day she left. And just like that, the storm passed. Life in the neighborhood changed dramatically. Without the HOA, people relaxed. Lawns grew a little wilder. Holiday decorations stayed up a little longer, and kids played freely in the streets again. Far from falling into chaos, the community grew closer. We organized potlucks, block parties, and cleanup days. Not because we were forced to, but because we wanted to. As for me, I finally felt at peace. The flowers in my garden bloomed brighter than ever, and I could sit on my porch without scanning the street for Karen's watchful glare. I had fought for my freedom, and I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone around me. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky, in shades of gold, my son joined me on the porch. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his iced tea, and said, "You know, Mom, I think this place finally feels like home." I smiled, watching the neighborhood kids race by on their bikes, their laughter filling the air. "Yes," I said softly, "it finally does." And for the first time in years, I believed it.